Hello, I'm John Burke for the Daily Reckoning. We are coming to you today from our perch overlooking the White House in our nation's capital. Welcome to this emergency briefing with Jim Rickards, financial threat and asymmetric warfare advisor to the White House, Pentagon, and CIA. Rickards joins us today with an urgent warning, one he hopes all Americans will heed. According to Jim Rickards and members of the U.S. intelligence community, the time to prepare has arrived. Since ancient times, the financial elite have been planning, waiting. Dreams of domination, of total control, have been passed down. Their plan has changed hands countless times, but its core goal has remained unchanged, nurtured through generations. From Caesar to Charlemagne, from Napoleon to Roosevelt, and down to the present day, and the first generation with the technology to carry that plan out. When they unleash it on an unsuspecting public, there will be no time to prepare, no time to react. In just 48 hours, the elites will freeze bank and brokerage accounts worldwide. Millions of Americans will lose access to their own money, in some cases, forever.
Economies operate in cycles. They go through booms and busts, expansions and recessions. Therefore, crises should not come as a surprise. Business cycles are a direct cause of excessive credit flow into the market. This is facilitated by an intentionally low interest rate set by the government. This situation gives the false impression that money originally saved for investment has increased and the pool of investable funds is bigger. This creates an illusion and leads to misallocation of investments or malinvestments. Credit inflation is a distortion of what is actually available to support current production and consumption levels. That is why a correction is inevitable.
Well, credit card debt could reach $1 trillion this year, nearing its all-time high of $1.02 trillion, reached back in July of 2008, just as the financial crisis was heating up.
Americans now have the highest revolving debt in U.S. history. According to the Federal Reserve, Americans collectively owe over $1 trillion in credit debt.
Credit card debt is exploding in this country. For the first time in American history, Americans as a whole own more than $1 trillion just to credit card companies.
But we are reaching the boom phase of this long-term cycle, meaning we are approaching a devastating bust.
When everybody's thinking the same way, somebody's not thinking, and you should at least examine the other side.
Yeah. The question is, how much longer will the rest of the world throw good money after bad because they don't want to admit the mistakes that they've made?
I sort of figured it would all work out, and I didn't have to think about it too much. And so I didn't.
Until that is, he had to.
Money. I have learned that. Credit cards are dangerous. If you want something and you have room on a credit card, you can buy it.
You actually think you're going to take on a multi-billion-dollar company who studies your behavior more than you study your behavior? Think about it. Did you know the credit card is the most aggressively marketed product in the history of humankind? Why? Because I started understanding that behavior affects your ability to build wealth more than all your little math tricks you think you see all the variables on. The borrower is slave to the lender, and yet you tell me you're going to beat the credit card company. You spend 12 to 18% more on average when you use plastic than when you use cash. That's what all the studies show us, because you don't feel the pain.
And those things, most of the time, not all the time, are unforeseen or uncontrolled. The debt piles up on the cards. It's the best place, not best place, easiest place for people to borrow money by charging and paying only the minimum monthly. The debt accumulates, and they're done in a very short period of time. Now, it's the easiest place to accumulate debt, but it's also the most dangerous.
It leaves them in a position where only one incident, whether it's a job loss, a divorce, an illness, can push them right over the edge.
Just to illustrate this, I'll use a metaphor. So you're on a mountain, it's snowing and snowing and snowing. The snow is building up, a big snowpack is building up on the side of a mountain. And any seasoned mountaineer can look at that and say, that's going to turn into an avalanche. That's unstable, it's going to collapse. It's there for now, but it's inherently unstable, it's going to collapse, right? And then one snowflake comes along perturbs a few other snowflakes, it lands the wrong way, they gather momentum, it becomes a chute, it becomes a slide, momentum builds, the whole thing rips loose, kills some skiers and bury the village below. That's the dynamics of an avalanche collapse. Exact same thing in financial markets. It only takes a very small initial event.
We are headed into a massive recession. Trump bought the economy some time with the tax cuts, but all it's doing is pushing off the day of reckoning. We had to borrow a lot of money to finance those tax cuts, despite what Donald Trump is saying. The trade deficit now is running at a 10-year high.
But isn't that a function, Peter, of people having more money in their pocket and they are buying more product, whether it's foreign or made here?
They're buying more imported products, but where's the money come from? It's coming from debt.
But it doesn't happen in a day. And Stuart, when I said it's going to be the biggest market downturn in my lifetime, I mean, that's not so strange to me. 2008, we had a problem because of too much debt. Stuart, as you well know, the debt has skyrocketed since 2008. Yep. So when I say it's going to be worse than my lifetime, how could it not be?
Natural disaster, a political, assassination, something. Could be a lot of things that are the snowflake. But go back to the avalanche. You go up in the high ridge lines in Switzerland or Colorado early in the morning. What is the ski patrol doing? The ski patrol's out there with dynamite, shooting cannons and setting up dynamite charges to break up the snowpack. So what they're doing, as a physicist, I would say, they're descaling the system. They're breaking up little avalanches so the big avalanche doesn't happen, making it safe for the skiers in the town below. Now, bring that over to the capital markets. We should be descaling the system.
I was a lender for 30 years. When you make a loan, you deposit that loan into the borrower's checking account. That's new money in the system. And that new money in the system is what creates a boom. A lot of lending creates a large boom. We think one of the things that has to be addressed are those private debt levels. One thing to consider there is debt restructuring or debt forgiveness. And the ancient word for that is jubilee. We don't think that financial crises can be avoided. And we don't think that financial crises can be properly repaired after the fact if we don't understand what really causes them.
But I explained that there's a household debt issue of about $15 trillion out there. Is that the only debt that we need to be worried about?
Yeah. No, everybody is loaded up with debt, and it's not like we began this monetary experiment without much debt. We had a lot of debt in 2008. In fact, the financial crisis was about debt. It was about our inability to pay the debt that we had. But instead of addressing the problem and allowing debt to be paid down, the Federal Reserve led us down the primrose path into much deeper debt. In fact, because we kept it going so long, the collapse is going to be that much bigger. I mean, the sooner we face that reality, the better. But no politician wants to face that reality.
Right.
I mean, they want to pretend everything is great.
Right, of course.
So I want you to think about that, because this biggest market crash is coming. It's guaranteed now.
You have a tsunami-sized problem coming towards you, and you probably don't even know it. That killer wave is the national debt. Countries, like people, go into debt when they spend more than they have. You and I buy things with the money we earn. Governments buy things with money they get from taxes. When spending outstrips revenue, the government is in the hole. Right now, most investors believe the United States is a safe bet. They believe, in other words, that they'll get the money they loan to the U.S. back with interest. But this can't go on indefinitely. At some point, investors are going to say, you have too much debt. You're a bad risk. No more money.
The following is a direct message about what's going on and how you can protect yourself. Please stay tuned. The epicenter of this next great world shift will be right here in America. Now, I must warn you that some of the facts I'm about to tell you may seem incredible, yet they are true. In fact, we've recently passed what I believe to be the point of no return, which means that a crisis is now inevitable and unstoppable. You see, what most people don't realize is that in the 1950s, the United States began switching over to an entirely new kind of economic system. And no, I'm not talking about the end of the gold standard. That happened in the 70s. This new system has allowed us to amass more wealth on paper than any other nation in history. Despite the collapse of our industrial sector in the 70s, despite our manufacturing base moving overseas, resulting in lost jobs and broken towns all over America, despite 2 major market crashes in just 15 years, the new system made our economy what it is. It's what keeps our lights on, our grocery stores' shelves stocked, our gas stations fueled, our Social Security checks in the mail, and our investments producing gains. And if you've ever wondered how we managed to keep going despite every sign pointing to a coming collapse, this is it. As a society, we are now more than ever dependent on convenience, on free government services instead of our own hard work, on credit instead of our own hard-earned cash. You see, this situation never actually got resolved. Instead, it got worse. A McKinsey study tells us that there's $57 trillion more debt today than there was in 2007, and it's growing. In fact, it's being artificially pumped up by the Federal Reserve and other central banks. As you can see from the chart above, our current credit system started around 1950. In the late 70s, traditional American industries such as cars, steel, televisions, radios, even computers moved overseas. Credit came in and replaced traditional wage increases as a way to prop up our economy. That's what triggered the massive growth phase it entered around that time. Agora warned in 1993 that it would begin to unwind, that the credit cycle would come to an end. That nearly happened in 2000, when the credit system first stalled out and the dot-coms went bust. But then, housing was there to support it. All that credit rushed into the housing market, which then shot up to meteoric levels. But when housing collapsed, there was nothing else to keep us going. That's when the Federal Reserve started buying up bonds and mortgages. Starting with a balance sheet of $700 billion before the crisis, the Federal Reserve is now on the hook for $4.5 trillion. That's how much new cash and credit it has put into the system in the last 6 years. Our lender of last resort, the Federal Reserve, has become too big to fail. Unfortunately, if it does, there's no higher entity that can step in, save our credit system. It has simply gotten too big. We've seen countries get hit with financial shocks like this again and again. In just the last century, I can name at least 38 events very similar to what I'm describing. But none of them has even come close to the scale of a potential collapse here in America. That's because none of these countries has ever been able to borrow so much or become so dependent on credit. We're going to see just how dependent we've become, and I'm not looking forward to it. America's unique status as the world's superpower has enabled us to keep borrowing at unheard of levels, all on the assumption that we're good for it. But we're not, and at some point, someone will realize that. When Americans can no longer use their credit cards, of course, believing nothing will ever change is actually a form of delusion. Totally irrational. But it's necessary for our survival. The problem, though, is that sometimes things do change, big time, and we are unprepared when really big changes are about to strike. People refuse to believe what's often right in front of them. Lawyers call this willful blindness. Psychologists call it the normalcy bias. That's why, while I was warning our subscribers about the dot-com bubble, for example, plenty of people thought it would never end. A famous book at the time, Dow 36,000, argued that the stock market was cheaper than ever. An article published in The Atlantic read, "Stock prices could double, triple, or even quadruple tomorrow and still not be too high." Then suddenly the Nasdaq started falling and eventually wiped out 77% of its value. Today, I'm seeing the same willful blindness here in America. People believe that our credit economy can just keep going forever, that we can keep borrowing and spending money that really isn't there. They think debt can go up faster than income indefinitely, even though it's mathematically impossible. And now, our highest government officials are still locked in a desperate struggle to keep this system going. And the fact of the matter is, they've already used up all the tools they have. They've kept credit cheap by reducing interest rates to near zero. How much lower can they put the rate if the system runs into trouble? They've already expanded the Fed's balance sheet by 542% in just a few years. How much more can they do? History is full of people who thought they were the exception, just like most Americans believe today. These stories always play out the same way. People think the rules don't apply to them. They think they can get away with something that no one else has. Our credit economy is no different. The rules still apply. Credit is not real money. It's just the flip side of debt. You run up too much debt, and you go broke. And many, many Americans are about to learn this eternal truth the hard way. We can't build the biggest credit system in world history and expect it to stay standing forever. Eventually, someone loses faith. In fact, we've seen this before right here in America. In 1819, people in America started noticing that banks were always trying to get out of honoring cash deposits. They'd give you an IOU instead, supposedly as good as real money. But attempts to redeem those notes for actual money were actually blocked or stalled in some way. Suddenly, cash started to skyrocket in value, with banks desperately trying to cover up the fact that they couldn't actually honor their deposits. They didn't have enough money. When the American public, along with foreign creditors, caught on to this, a third of America's money vanished into a black hole. The Western territories ran out of cash completely. They had to switch to a barter system using grain. Real estate and land prices dropped off a cliff, as did income from rents. You couldn't sell anything because no one had the money to buy it from you, and no one would risk a loan because there wasn't necessarily enough cash to get it back. Nearly half of all the money in the country disappeared. The resulting economic collapse stretched on well into the following decade. And we were lucky, because we were young. And the collapse happened before the problem was bad enough to do permanent damage. And back then, most families were self-sufficient, and the whole economy worked on cash, not credit. Today, it's a different story. We have a credit system worth more on paper than the national wealth of most countries, and it's already starting to come apart. Ever since that 2008 morning, when the Treasury noticed billions disappearing from the U.S. economy, the Federal Reserve has been locked in a desperate struggle to keep this event at bay, and it hasn't worked. They've even been flooding the U.S. economy with more new money than ever to try to make up the shortfall.
You're extremely careful with money.
What?
Forget it.
I'm cheap? You think I'm cheap?
See?
How could you say that to me? I can't believe this. How could you say that to me?
You asked me to.
You should have lied.
So should you.
Okay, wait a second. What happened to my papers? I mean, I'm not really working right now.
I know.
When I was working, I spent, baby. Yeah, I know. Champagne, limos, cigars.
This is going to be a sequel to 2008. And like all sequels, it's going to be bad. This one is going to have an even worse ending than the last one because it's not going to end with a dollar rally and a sell-off in gold. It's going to end with the opposite. Gold is going to take off and the dollar is going to collapse, and the inflationary recession that is going to follow the bursting of this bubble is going to be far more disruptive and painful for the average American. You know, back in 2008, one of the reasons the dollar had been so weak was because we had large budget deficits and large trade deficits, and people were smart enough to realize that was a problem. Well, today, we have even bigger budget deficits and even bigger trade deficits, and nobody thinks it's a problem at all. In fact, they think it's good for the dollar.
Hopefully, this will give us a greater sense of urgency to act.
which we have to do something about or we can't solve the problem. And the longer we wait, the worse the problem gets. So it's prudent to act sooner rather than later because time is working against us.
Is there a good way out? Yes, there is. If the economy grows robustly, the government will take in more revenue, and it can then use that increased revenue to pay the debt down. The second way out of debt is to cut spending. If we spend more than we take in, which is what we've been doing, we're going to go deeper and deeper into debt. Common sense would suggest that we bring our revenue, the money the government takes in taxes, and our spending in line. If you combine the two, robust growth and reduced spending, we have a real chance to get control of our national finances. So is the debt a big problem? If you're worried just about tomorrow, probably not. But if you're worried about the future, and especially if you have a lot of future in front of you, yes, it is a really big problem, as big as a tsunami.
I think the first thing that you need to do is realize that it's the issue is a national emergency. I would like the president to declare it as a national emergency.
Think about it. You can look at any business, and if you want to know what shifts a business, what shifts your life, there's one force: decision making. Decision making is the force that shapes destiny, personal, corporate, business destiny. How many of you can think of the decisions that you made years ago, 1 or 2 decisions, 5, 10, 15 years ago? That decision, you may not have realized it at the time, but that decision was one of the most important decisions of your life. If you'd made a different decision there, you'd gone a different direction, your life would be completely different today. Who can relate to this in your life? Say I. The secret then is getting darn good at making more effective decisions. But most people don't have the guts to make the tough decisions because they want to make the right decision, so they make no decision. And that's a decision. Isn't it true? And what happens is the world takes them over. So decision making is the power. So if you're going to control your life, the way you take control is by making new choices. If you don't like how things are, what do you got to do? Change it. And to change it, you have to make a decision. And by the way, leaders make decisions. That's what makes somebody a leader. They have the guts to make the most difficult decisions nobody else has the guts to make.